Hey, I'm Jamey from Stonemaier Games, and today I'm here to talk about 25 different high interaction mechanisms in competitive games. There are a few caveats to this category, so I'm not including dueling games, head-to-head, one-to-one, two-player dueling games, not including them on this list. These are, I guess, multiplayer beyond two-player competitive games that have high interaction mechanisms that, crucially, aren't cruel to your friends. So these are games where your decisions consistently impact other players without being cruel to your friends. This topic stemmed from a great conversation on Board Game Geek about Wingspan, one of our games at Stonemaier Games, that has a number of different interactions with players. I wouldn't call it a high interaction game, but it definitely has a number of ways that your decisions impact other players. And it was interesting to see some people saying, I wish there were ways in Wingspan that I could sabotage other players or be mean to other players. And not only do I think that that would significantly damage Wingspan, that isn't what the game is all about. Not every game needs to be a game where you're hurting other players, but also, does any game need to be a game where you're being cruel to your friends? I don't know. I would wager to say no. I don't play many games like that at all where I'm cruel to my friends, but I still love to play games with a lot of tension and a lot of reasons to pay attention to other players, and even ways that my decisions can directly impact other players. So that's what I'm here to talk about today. I found 25 different examples of ways that I really like that are not about being cruel to your friends, and yet they are high interaction games. I will mention some caveats. One, the more interaction that a game has, the more difficult it is to plan ahead for your turn. This is something that you'll find in almost all of these games that I mentioned here. In high interaction games, you lose largely the ability to plan ahead, which means that there's more downtime, there's more oftentimes it results in a longer game, or it can really lead into some analysis paralysis. When it gets to your turn, you haven't been able to plan ahead, so you have to make a decision then. Also, I think there can be an abundance of drama in a game, even when the interaction is minimal. And an example of this, there's lots of examples, but an example of this that I think about a lot, because I play a lot of disc golf, is in disc golf, it is a high drama game. I am entranced every time someone else is throwing the disc, even though it has absolutely no impact on my throw or my ability to score in that round. We are not interacting at all, and yet there's a lot of drama. So I think that's, even though I won't go into that on today's list, I do think that you can have a game with a lot of drama, even though it doesn't have a lot of interaction. Yeah, so let's jump in. Before I jump into my 25 examples, I asked our panelists, who play a lot of games in different ways than I do, for their picks for this category. So I asked Kari, our heavy gamer on the panel, what her favorite games are. And she listed The White Castle. She says the tension of which dice to select is a constant struggle, and it always seems like everyone takes the exact one you need. Good luck planning ahead. I mentioned tough to plan ahead. She also mentioned Dune Imperium. She says every aspect of Dune Imperium causes tension, whether I in a worker placement spot or preparing for battle at the end of a round. I'll talk about Dune Imperium on my list a little bit later. Kari also talked about Fields of Arle, which is a two-player game. I wouldn't necessarily say it's a dueling game, but it is a two-player game. And she says the worker placement spots are quite competitive and can really make you have to adjust your strategy. So actually 3 different worker placement examples here. Worker placement is a great category of games where there is a lot of interaction between other players. The decision that you make to place a worker in worker placement directly impacts where other people can place their workers. I also asked Skiler, our family gamer on the panel list. She picked Sorcerer's Arena. This is a head-to-head dueling game, so she did pick a dueling game for this, where you get to play as different Disney characters. She also picked King of Tokyo at number 2. She says we have a blast playing as monsters vying for control of Tokyo in this game. I'll mention that as an example on my list later. And then Uno Attack. She says her kids laugh so much when the cards shoot out at them during this game. And if you would like it to be more competitive, check out Uno Show 'Em No Mercy. And last, I have Aryn. Aryn had a tough puzzle here, because Aryn is our solo gamer panelist. And solo games, how are you going to have high interaction games in a solo game? But Aryn thought about this and came up with 3 examples. One, they mentioned Andromeda's Edge. In Andromeda's Edge, you face off against Unity, an enemy force determined to eradicate you from existence. They follow you wherever you go, except when you go into a nebula. They constantly get into battles with you when you're out in space. And if that isn't enough, you have to contend with raiders. This worker placement game becomes much more sinister when playing alone. Achieving victory will be tough, as the setup is arduous. Okay, maybe not that tough, Aryn says. And number 2, Aryn says Gloomhaven, Jaws of the Lion. So they did pick a cooperative game here, but playing solo. So I think it's allowable on this list. In a solo game, you're controlling 2 characters at once. You have both characters interact with each other through combos that can be devastating to the enemy forces you're up against. A fun game, but when played alone, keep in mind that you have to control 2 characters, which requires much more thought than just one. That's why they chose Jaws of the Lion. And last, A Feast for Odin. In the solo mode Vikings, you can play on the action board, and the Vikings that you place on the action board stay on the board between rounds. So you are constantly interacting with both your past self and your future self with every decision you make. That's pretty cool. Do you take this action knowing in the next round it'll be blocked from you when you may need it? More, did you take an action only to be confronted with the fact that you took it last round and now blocked yourself from performing it? A Feast for Odin is a solo experience where you'll be constantly stepping on your own toes round to round. Really clever choice there from Aryn, our solo gamer on the panelist. And now let's jump into my list. So I did mention King of Tokyo. Here is indeed King of Tokyo on this list. And I'm going to go, this is 25 games, categories, even more than 25 games on this list. So I'm going to go through and just say the thing about this game that is high interaction. King of Tokyo is a dynamic one versus many game, in that you are fighting other players, but you are either fighting the player who is in Tokyo at the time, or if you're the player in Tokyo, when you deal damage, you deal that damage to everyone who's not in Tokyo. So a key decision point in the game is, when do I go into Tokyo so that I can hit everybody? When do I stay outside Tokyo so I can only be hit by the player in Tokyo? When am I jumping in and out? When do I want to be that player in the middle versus the player on the outside? It doesn't feel like you're targeting or being cruel to any particular player, because when you're in the middle, you're not deciding which player to hit. And when you're on the outside, the only player that you can hit is the one in the middle. King of Tokyo. Rumble Nation is the next one. Rumble Nation is one of a few different combat games. Combat is one of many different forms of interaction. It is not the only form of interaction in a game with high player interaction. But in Rumble Nation, I think the really clever thing about it is that once you get to the combat stage of the game, it is completely automated. You have set yourself up for the automation by all the decisions that you made during the game. So when it comes time to beat up the other players, the game just runs it for you. You are not making any decisions during that time, which I think is really clever. It takes away from the aspect of spite or cruelty or being mean to other players. That's Rumble Nation. Challengers is a game where you actually break into little duels throughout the game, even though most of the over the course of the game, you're playing duels against a number of other players. And so it's this rotating 1-versus-1 system. So I included this as a clever exception to the dueling game rule, where it is essentially a dueling dueling game with a sense of automation, similar to Rumble Nation. But you have a lot of little duels throughout the game against other players. So rotating dueling game in Challengers. Next up, we have Libertalia Winds of Galecrest. This is our game from Stonemaier Games. This is a game where you are choosing simultaneously a character from your hand to play onto the island, and then all the characters activate in different ways. And when that happens, the targeting, you aren't targeting specific players in Libertalia. Rather, a card might say the player, the character with the highest rank on the ship gets knocked, or not on the ship, on the island, gets knocked off the island. It might be things like that. So you're not targeting players in Libertalia. You're targeting preset things like what rank they are, or where they are on someone else's ship, or that you're looking at neighbors, things like that. So I think that's a really clever way that you're not targeting specific players. You're targeting conditions on other characters in the game. So that's Libertalia Winds of Galecrest. Ra is the example I chose for auction games. Auction games are high interaction games. You're auctioning things actively with other players. You're trying to win certain tiles in Ra and not win certain tiles in Ra. I think auction games are a great way to have high player interaction without spite or cruelty. Kemet, another, that was Ra. Kemet is another combat game. But I think Kemet does combat really well because it's a tight space, and there are balanced consequences to the combat. So if you play a combat card that deals a lot of damage to your opponent that you're fighting, that combat card probably comes with a downside where it has less defense, or it might mean that you have to lose some units, or your opponent loses fewer units as a result. The combat cards, I think, are really well designed in Kemet to be balanced in that even though you might win one aspect of combat, there's a sacrifice to that as well that might hurt you or might hurt the opponent less. Also, I think in Kemet, the combat is really clever because even when you lose combat, when you do lose combat, it actually gives you an opportunity to refresh your units and jump back in and be stronger on the board when you rejoin the map. So I think that's a clever aspect of the combat in Kemet. Next up, we have my favorite form of interaction, positive player interaction, the example being Apiary. I also think Santa's Workshop does a great job at this. So in Apiary, whenever you place your workers on the board, they the strength of the action that you're taking is often impacted by other workers that are already there, and or you might be bumping workers that are there, your own workers or someone else's workers. So almost on every single turn in apiary, your decisions impact other players in a positive way. You are doing things that either helps other players or other players will have already done something that helps you when you decide to place your worker on that action. So that's positive player interaction, or one example of positive player interaction. I have a whole video about this if you find that you like this form of interaction. Next up, we have Lords of Waterdeep. I actually just played this digitally last night. I love Lords of Waterdeep. This is a game where the example I wanted to give here, because this is a worker placement game with blocking, there are some direct forms of interaction in the intrigue cards. In fact, there is a way that you can be cruel to specific players in the intrigue cards. But the thing that I think is great about Lords of Waterdeep, decisions you make constantly impact other players, are the building tiles, where you, by building a building, you expand the action options for all other players. And once those buildings are down on the table, it gives you a tempting choice as a player. Do I place my worker on this really powerful building? But when I do that, the player who built it gets a little benefit as well. So I think that is a really cool aspect of player interaction in Lords of Waterdeep. Two examples here in our game, Stamp Swap, probably our most interactive game, is that it is a game that has drafting. So you are drafting different tiles from a common pool. So you're taking things from a common pool. Once you take it, other players can't take it. And it features I Cut You Choose, another great interaction method where you are trying to figure out what other players want or don't want. And you're dividing your stamps into two, or really all the items that you have, not just stamps, into two different piles for another player to take one pile. You get to keep the rest. So I'll talk about drafting again in a second, but I think drafting and I Cut You Choose are great high interaction player mechanisms in games. That's Stamp Swap. Next up, we have trading. Games that have trading, especially I enjoy trading that happens kind of in real time. There's Bonanza, there's Millennium Blades, the Sidereal Confluence, and there's Trade on the Tigris, probably one of my favorites out of that bunch, where most of the game is a real-time trading phase where you're trying to trade cards with other players to get the cards that you want to complete sets and get rid of cards that might score you negative points if you don't complete those sets. It's a very high interaction game in that there's a lot of active talking. You're talking all over other players. It might be even a little bit too much for some players because of the amount of trading, but I think it's a great way to interact with other players. Trading with other players is a great high interaction mechanism. Next up, we have Between Two Cities is my example for Neighbors Matter. I'd also include Between Two Castles and the game Planet Unknown, where in Between Two Cities and Between Two Castles, you are building things with the player on the left and the player on your right. This is combined with a drafting mechanism where you're drafting tiles or you're passing them around the table. Drafting, again, is a high player interaction mechanism. But in Between Two Cities and Between Two Castles, because you're building things with the players on your left and your right, and you have to balance those two things so that one isn't too much better than the other one because you only score your lowest of your two cities or your lowest of your two castles. There's a lot of discussions that happen with those two players on your left and right in Between Two Cities. So neighbors matter. The players on the left and your right, when that matters. Seven Wonders is another game where your neighbors matter for warfare. That can be a great high interaction mechanism. So that's Between Two Cities. Next up, we have Downforce. So Downforce is a racing game. So racing, I think, is inherently a good player interaction mechanism because you're jockeying for position. You're trying to get out in front of other players, especially when there's tight gaps. But also in Downforce, it offers the mechanism of shared control. Whenever you play a card in Downforce, for the most part, on almost all cards, it means that not only is your car moving forward, but some other cars are moving forward as well. So in every single turn, the decisions you make are impacting which other cars can move and which other cars can move on future turns if you've created some places where cars can't squeak through the gaps that you've created or blocked up in the game. So that's Downforce, racing and shared control. Next up, we have Root, a game that is high interaction for combat, but it is a game that I think that it can feature some combat where you're directly impacting other players. But the reason I wanted to highlight it is that Root has different instant win conditions. Each player has their own different instant win condition. And so it gives you a high reason to not only pay attention to other players, but also get in the way of other players achieving that instant win condition so that you can achieve your instant win condition first. So I think Root and other games that have instant win conditions offer a great form of player interaction in that way. Next up, we have Crokinole, a dexterity game on this list. Crokinole offers High player interaction, because on every single turn, the game says you have to hit one of your opponent's tokens. That is a condition for you to flick your token onto the Crokinole board. You have to hit one of your opponent's tokens. So not only is it a dexterity game, but the game includes a rule saying you must interact with other players every turn. It's not a mean thing to do in Crokinole. It's just what you have to do to get your token on the board. Next up, we have voting. Voting, I think, is a great way to encourage discussions and interactions with other players. And I think the game that has the best voting in it is the King's Dilemma. I love playing the King's Dilemma and having this element of voting on every single decisions we make in the game. And in King's Dilemma, there's also bribery that goes along with that. You might say, okay, if you vote along with me, I will bribe you. I'll give you some money so that you vote along with me this round. I think voting is a great way, especially if you have that aspect, that secondary aspect of bribing, kind of trading combined with voting, can work really well for high interaction. The game Hegemony, I've only played Hegemony once, but Hegemony also has some voting that happens every round in a slightly different way than King's Dilemma. Both Raising Robots and Roll for the Galaxy and some other games like Puerto Rico have shared action selection. This is another high interaction mechanism where the action that you choose impacts what other players can do. It either says everyone else takes the same action, so they're all following the same action, or like in Raising Robots and Roll for the Galaxy, by choosing an action, you're saying in addition to the action that all other players chose, we're all taking this action. So you are expanding, kind of similar to Lords of Waterdeep, but in a different way. You are expanding the action options each round through the action that you choose in Raising Robots. I think that's element of shared action selection is a great example of high interaction. Next up, we have my game, Scythe. So Scythe is a game that has combat in it, but is more about the threat of combat. So I think this is a nice little twist to have in certain games that have the potential for combat, but make the threat of combat more important, where you don't actually want players constantly fighting each other. And you do this, or one of the ways that you can do this in Scythe, there's a loss in popularity oftentimes when you attack someone else. If you are the aggressor in Scythe and you end up forcing their workers off a territory, you lose popularity for each of those workers. And popularity has a huge impact on your endgame points in Scythe. And so, and yet in Scythe, all your resources are kept on the board. And so taking over a certain position, certain territory that has a lot of resources that your opponent hasn't protected or has protected can have a big impact on the game. So the threat of combat paired with tokens being on the board and victory points being impacted by your popularity in Scythe, I think has a great interaction mechanism in the game. So that's Scythe. Dune Imperium, a couple different elements of Dune Imperium. We mentioned earlier, I think Kari mentioned it, the idea of worker placement, blocking worker placement, and the combat in Dune Imperium. But the element I wanted to mention is that you're competing over the same victory points in Dune Imperium. I think this is a really clever way to have high player interaction, where in Dune Imperium, there are certain victory points that only one player can have at any given time based on the influence tracks. And so I think there's a great way to jockey for position, to be the first to get that point, because then someone has to surpass you, but then trying to hold on to it long enough so someone doesn't surpass you. Maybe you get to the top of the tracks and no one can take that point from you from then on. So shared victory points, or not shared, but competing over the same victory points is a great mechanism like this in Dune Imperium. Fromage, a game that you may not think of having high player interaction, because it is a simultaneous game where what you're doing on your turn literally has no impact in that moment on anyone else. But when you then rotate that whole board and someone else is faced with a decision that you made because your token, your cheese token, is in a slot that they may have wanted, you're actually offering quite a bit of interaction in Fromage. So I'm calling it simultaneous, but with shared puzzles, where you're taking turns interacting with different puzzles, but the choice that you make on that puzzle has a big impact on what other players can do on that puzzle. That's Fromage. The game Nemesis is a semi-cooperative game. So semi-cooperation, I think, is a great high interaction mechanism where you're sometimes cooperating, working together with other players, but in the end, you're probably competing, but you're hoping not to trigger a loss condition for all players. And Nemesis does this in particular via secret agendas. So every player has their own goals that they're trying to achieve. A little bit like Root, but your goal is secret. You don't know what each player's goal is, but you know that all players are being a little bit devious in this game because they're trying to achieve their own goal. So I think this is a great way to have semi-cooperative play, but with secret agendas, or even cooperative play or competitive play with secret agendas, I think is a great high interaction mechanism, because you're always trying to figure out what what are the other players trying to achieve, and how can I get in their way a little bit while still trying to achieve my goal, either overall or before they do, or before we all lose or win together. That's Nemesis. Trick taking. Trick taking is a great high interaction mechanism because in trick taking, every card that you play into the trick has an impact on other players. It might improve. It might mean that you are the current winner of the trick. It might mean that you're losing the trick, but there might be a twist in that given game. The example I have is Cat in the Box. I also really love Skull King. Recently, I've enjoyed the Fellowship of the Ring, the trick-taking game. Lots of wonderful trick-taking games out there. Trick-taking is inherently a high interaction mechanism. And so I think that's a nice tool to have in your toolbox if you're thinking about high interaction games. Terra Mystica, a game not really known for having high interaction, but I think the shared map in Terra Mystica does a lot to encourage player interaction. Or just it's built into this map where when you build on a space, no one else can ever build there again. You can't take over different spaces. There's no combat in Terra Mystica, but by you building on that space, I can't build there. So there's often a race to get to certain spaces, and the game makes it even more interesting by saying that you get discounts on certain types of buildings if you build next to another player. And if you do that, they get some power from you doing that, some of the magic resource in the game. So the game does some really cool things to encourage you to build close to other players instead of spreading out on this map. It's encouraging interactions on this map that gets increasingly tight as you play throughout the game. So Terra Mystica, the shared map with an incentive to build close. Almost to the end here, we have Mlem. Mlem features a shared journey. I think a shared journey can be a great way to have high player interaction in games. So in Mlem, you are getting on a spaceship with a captain. One player is the captain each round, and all other players are choosing a different type of token to put on that ship. And that type of token might impact the success of the trip, or it might just impact when you want to jump off the ship onto a planet or a moon. But this idea of going on a journey together in a competitive game, I think is a really clever way to have a high player interaction mechanism. Second to last, we have another combat game, Small World. I think the thing that Small World does really, really cleverly is that the game makes it fun to be defeated and to start fresh. So I think this is a key if you have a combat game. Make it fun to actually lose combat from time to time, or to have your units slowly be whittled off the map like in Small World, because it gives you a choice of, is now the time for me to choose a different race and attribute, whatever they call it, the two combinations of things in Small World. Is now the time to choose it, or do I hold out for one more round with the current combination that I really like? But overall, it just feels, it's interesting to me that in a game like Small World, where it actually feels good to start over fresh with a new combination to see how that works in the game, rather than having that asymmetric pairing happen only at the beginning of the game. It happens throughout the game on an ongoing basis whenever you are defeated or you feel defeated in the game in Small World. And last, we have our game, Red Rising. So Red Rising is a game where on every single turn, you are deploying a card from your hand. So you're getting rid of a card from your hand, and then you are picking up a card from a different location on the board. So I think many of these games have cards, a row of cards, a river of cards that you're selecting from. But in Red Rising, almost the entire game is managing your hand and how your hand, or the cards that you give up, impact the cards that are out there on the display for other players. That has a huge impact on what other players can do. So even though Red Rising features very little targeting of other players, every single decision you make in the game, in fact, two decisions that you make in every turn, which card you give up and which card you pick up, impacts the decisions that other players can make, making Red Rising a high player interaction game. I hope these examples help give you some ideas. They certainly were helpful for me to put these together because I do like thinking about different ways that I can put high interaction in the games that we create here at Stonemaier Games. But crucially, I think while there are players out there, you might be one of them who enjoy, and your group might be the type of group where you enjoy having direct combat, direct conflict, where you don't mind being cruel to your friends. I think games are a safe space to be cruel to your friends in that way. If there's ever a space to do it, games are the place to do it. And yet, I think there are probably other people out there like me, where I don't enjoy being cruel to my friends, even in a game setting. It doesn't feel good for me to do that. And so I like that there's a lot of different types of games out there where I can have these high interaction experiences with my friends without being mean, cruel, or spiteful to them. These are all ways to do that. And so these are all games to seek out if you're seeking these types of interactions. And I hope when we're talking about interaction in games that we aren't just limiting those discussions to combat and direct conflict and cruelty, because there are so many other ways that you can have high interaction player mechanisms in games. Yeah, I'd love to know your thoughts. Let me know if there's anything that I left off the list or any great examples that you love in these categories that I mentioned. I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks.